Well, welcome to Brown Bag History. It's April 2nd, 2025. We'll be talking about the Farwell settlement, which is 140 years old this year. As we begin, we acknowledge that the land around Revelstoke and on the Columbia River and its tributaries is the Snacks homeland and traditional territory. We acknowledge the ties of the Secwepemc, the Okanagan Nation Alliance, and the Ktunaxa to this land. We acknowledge our use and habitation of this land sacred to these four nations. We respectfully honor their traditions and culture. So before we talk about the Farwell settlement, I did want to acknowledge that this was the homeland and territory of the Sinixt, and they did have a village site in what's now the Big Eddy, close to the Tonkawa or Tum Tum, and that their territory extended from Revelstoke, or a little north of Revelstoke, into what's now northern Washington state. And even by the time that there was settlement here, they had already been included on the Colville Reservation in the United States, along with several other nations. It was a combined reservation of several nations, and even by 1885, they were being called, American Indigenous people, and their rights to come up to this area were already being questioned. So, but they still considered this was their territory, and they were still wanting to access their territory here for their seasonal rounds for hunting and fishing, even though there was no longer sort of a village site that was still in use at that time, or at least not in a major way. There was still people that were accessing it. So, we always preface now the fact that this wasn't an empty landscape when the Farwell settlement began. So Farwell was an interesting character. He was born in Devonshire, England in 1841, and studied as a civil engineer and surveyor, and then came to Victoria, BC in 1864, and became a partner in a civil engineering and land surveying practice in Victoria. He was doing government surveys on Vancouver Island and in the lower Fraser Valley. And in 1871 to 1872, he was working on exploratory surveys of Eagle Pass and Yellowhead Pass as proposed locations for the Trans Canada Railway. And he was actually working with Walter Moberly's survey party. And they actually wintered at Big Eddy in 1871, 1872. So he was actually familiar with this area. He was the Surveyor General of BC from 1873 to 1878. So Major Rogers had surveyed Rogers Pass from both east and west by 1882. And Farwell made out an application for a land grant covering Lot 6, Block 1, Kootenay District, October 20th, 1883. The CPR route was not yet registered, although Sir Sandford Fleming had advised the BC government in the end of September that he had examined and approved the route line, and the company was ready to begin construction. But the provincial government claimed that it wasn't actually registered with them. So Farwell clearly knew that this area was going to be in the railway lands, and there'd been a agreement with the Dominion government and the provinces or territories where the railway was going to pass, that the provinces would sort of cede any unregistered land to the Dominion government, sort of on basically sort of 10 miles either side of the railway land, to be included in what they called the railway belt lands. And that was sort of a deal that they had put together, so that it was generally, so the railway belt lands were under the control of the Dominion government, but in a lot of cases they were ceding those lands to the CPR as a major perk for building the railway. So became a major issue when Farwell laid out his town site, and he actually his land grant was much bigger than the lands in the town site. His land grant actually included the Columbia Park up to sort of the point on the river where the golf course lands are now, and probably up to and a little bit beyond where the Highway 23 North goes, and then all the way to just the other side of the Illecillewaet River and to the mouth of the Illecillewaet. So it's a huge swath of land that was in his land grant. And he, he had, as I say, had applied for it in 1883. And in July of 1884, the Commissioner of Lands and Works instructed that the land applied for by Farwell be surveyed. And Farwell himself did the survey. So there's no question that there was sort of insider knowledge and that there was conflict of interest. Absolutely no question about it. And the purchase money for the lands were received by the Lands and Work Department at Victoria on November 17th, 1884. And then on January 13th, 1885, he received the title to his Crown grant of 1,175 acres. And by that time, he'd actually partly laid out his town site. The town site had originally been referred to as Columbia City, and it was actually in some cases referred to as Second Crossing, because this was going to be the second time that the railway would cross the Columbia River. And then it was referred to briefly as Columbia City, and then Farwell, as you do, named it after himself. He believed that his town would be a center of trade with the U.S., would be a manufacturing city, an administrative headquarters for the surrounding district, a tourist resort, and lumbering and mining center. And it wasn't entirely wrong in all of that, but at one point I think he was thinking that there'd be, up to 100,000 people here and around this area. So he had big dreams for the area. So you can see his town site itself was sort of really encompassing the area at the base of the sort of what's now the Courthouse Hill. So it's that sort of little triangle of land between the railway and the base of the hill. And you can see they actually call it Victoria Road, sort of going at the base of the base of the Douglas Street Hill in this sketch.
Lower Town.
Yeah, Lower Town. It was definitely referred to as Lower Town. You can also see here has John, James, George, Douglas, and Front Street. As I mentioned in my last talk, in 1900, they changed the names of John, James, and George streets to first, second, and third. But there's the original town site. The whole story of the dispute is very long and convoluted and a little bit boring, so I won't get into all the details. But it definitely went back several times between the Dominion government and the federal and the provincial government and Farwell. And there was it was that whole dispute of who had the right to distribute the property here. And over the course of about 10 years, went back and forth between ruling the Supreme Court and ruling in Farwell's favor to ruling in the Dominion, the federal, the Dominion or federal government's favor. And it was because the court case was not brought by the CPR, it was brought by Regina, so the Queen, or which was sort of the federal government was brought the suit under the name of the Queen. So it was Regina versus Farwell. And so it went back and forth for a long time. The upshot of that was it was finally settled in 1895, so 10 years after the settlement was started. And it basically just said both have rights and you should, so there was just some shuffling of money and lands back and forth between at that time mostly the CPR and Farwell and other landholders in the area. But it was still another 2 years because even over 140, 30 years ago, the wheels of bureaucracy still moved slowly. So it took another 2 years before people could get clear title to their lands. But in the meantime, and then of course that was sort of precipitated the whole shift between the Front Street, the original downtown, to where downtown is now, because once the CPR moved their station here instead of right in the center of Farwell's land, uh, it meant that the businesses wanted to be closer to the station, and it created that shift. So it was a long process. As I say, it's a very convoluted story, and I won't read you every newspaper article or government edict about it, because that's not that much fun. But we'll look at the town site itself. So this is the earliest photograph that we have showing downtown, Front Street, downtown Farwell. And you can see it's looks pretty Wild Westy at the time. The buildings are not terribly substantial, with the exception of the one on the side, the Columbia House. And Columbia House was what we believe to be the first hotel in Farwell, and it was built by a man named W.M. Brown, who had been in the Caribou area previous to that, to this, and came here, established this hotel, the Columbia House, and that's it's on the other side of, I have to look at my map a little bit more closely, but I think uh, on the side of, so this would be what's now Wilson Street here. And so it's just the other side of what's now Wilson Street. And you can see that the buildings are pretty rough looking. There was actually a fire that ripped through the town in early May in 1885. So you can see sort of the burnt out trees there. And within the month, so the Victoria newspaper on May 30th, 1885, reported that the town is almost rebuilt. So like basically 3 weeks, they rebuilt the town. It said on the 24th, there were 83 houses erected and others in progress. It said Mr. S. Adler passed through Farwell on his way up the river. He had been informed that fully 500 miners were prospecting in the Big Bend country. And there were also a complaint in that article that there was no justice in Revelstoke. There was no magistrate or police presence here. There was an interview with Mr. Farwell in the Daily Colonist in February of 1885, and he said that there was at that time there was a lot of goods being sent up from the United States, actually from Portland up the Columbia River. There was an early steamboat that was bringing goods up to here. And Farwell said, I wintered there a dozen years ago and then conceived the idea that there must be a city there if the railway comes that way. The site stretches for 2.5 miles along the east bank of the Columbia River, opposite Eagle Pass, and is above all chance of flooding. A great part of the site is practically already cleared, and the rest is easily cleared. The frontage tends to give good landing, and the deep water is on that side. The whole town site contains 1,175 acres, about the size of Victoria. And he said, I've already partly surveyed it for the town purpose of a town site. And now I'm only waiting the result of negotiations with the railway company as to their requirements. And of course, at that time, he was thinking that the station would be the other side of the railway. So basically where the Woodenhead Park is now, I think that was his original plan. Of course, that never happened because the CPR just refused to deal with him. So anyway, this was downtown Revelstoke in 1885. You can see that there's a tent there. And when we enlarged this photograph and looked at the sign on the front of the tent, it said red light. So that was a brothel. Probably could be one of the first of many that perpetuated in Lower Town for many, many years. So of course the town site was really created because of the coming of the Canadian Pacific Railway, which was completed at Craigellachie on November 7th, 1885. And it was sort of people who realized that this would be a center for the railway, and because of its placement on the Columbia River, it was a good place for traffic, boat traffic north and south. So it was always seen as a place that could become a major center in the interior of the province. There was a Northwest Mounted Police Barracks at the top of Douglas Street Hill in 1885, and that's Colonel Sam Steele in front. And I've spoken before about the Farwell Police War, so I won't get into a lot of detail about that now, but suffice it to say it was about alcohol and about who had the right to bring in and sell alcohol. The Northwest Mounted Police were really there to police the railway construction. And the law that they were following was that there were no liquor sales in the railway belt, in the railway construction belt. Whereas this town site was developing and there were hotels there, and the hotels owners were purchasing legal provincial liquor licenses to sell liquor in their hotels. And according to the provincial law, they were entitled to do that. According to the federal law, they were not. So that became a conflict. The mounted police officers and the provincial police officers were arresting each other. It got quite comical for a while, but there was also threats of sort of mass shootouts on Front Street. It never quite got to that, but there was definitely people being knocked down and dragged to each other's jail cells. They finally got that all sorted out, and they were from that time they were following the provincial laws regarding liquor sales. There's a photograph of the bridge, the original railway bridge being constructed in 1885. And that was completed in October of 1885, so just before the final little push to get to Craigellachie for the completion of the line.
Same spot, like just a little bit beside it.
Basically in the same spot, like it's probably just like one very either side of it, but basically it's basically the same spot. It's been replaced 3 times. Yeah.
You can sort of see an extra, I want to say hump, where they used to.
Yeah, I think it was just sort of right beside, yeah. But basically the same area. There's a photograph of I think it's probably just at the tail end or just sort of finishing up some of the work on the bridge. Something just got dumped off there. I could see the big splash. So the first provincial magistrate that came here was Gilbert Malcolm Sproat. And the interesting thing to note is that he was a business partner with A.S. Farwell. So again, the conflicts of interest were pretty blatant, so he was the first magistrate here, and he was the one that was it was under his supervision that he was sort of overseeing this police war that was going on. But they once they got that settled, as I said, he was establishing the provincial rules here. And the person who joined him was John or Big Jack Kirkup, who was the first police constable here. And remember reading one story from the Dickey family that when Mrs. Dickey arrived in town, they were originally staying in little rented quarters down in Lower Town, and she woke up in the morning and opened her curtains to see Jack Kirkup walking across the street with a drunk person under each arm, carrying him off to the jail. So he was sort of seen as somebody you didn't mess with, basically. But they were operating on the provincial law and following the provincial laws here. So this is an interesting photograph. We have 2 photographs taken by the Victoria Photography Studio of Richard and Hannah Maynard. And Hannah Maynard was one of the first women photographers in the province. So we're not sure whether she took these or Richard took them or whether they were both here on that trip. But these are, this and another photograph are two of the earliest photographs we have of the Farwell town site. And this was actually a very short-lived toll bridge that was over the river. You can see the Columbia House Hotel right there. So this would actually be probably pretty close to the location where the current Big Eddy Bridge goes across. And you can see the little toll house there. So we had to pay a bit of a toll to cross that one. And it was short-lived. Once the railway bridge was in place, this one was no longer there. You can see a tent, the edge of a tent on this side of the river. The bridge and tote road from Sicamous had been built by a well-known British Columbia road builder named Gustavus Blinn Wright. Wright Street is named after him. And he was actually operating a small sawmill on the west side of the river as well. So a lot of the construction materials were being produced by his sawmill. And then this is the other photograph from the Maynard studio. And it's looking sort of from probably the base of the hill or sort of beyond Douglas Street over towards the river. And you can actually see a couple of buildings on the west bank of the river there. I can see just faintly the bridge and all the snags from the fire that had occurred. So this was taken in 1885, so not a heck of a lot going on there. You can see a few buildings on the street. And again, there's the Columbia House there. It kind of, the big roof sticks out a bit there. And there's another photograph, probably from about 1890 or so. You can see the railway bridge. And so this had been probably taken from the sort of side of the Douglas Street Hill, looking down onto Front Street. So to sort of finish off talking about Farwell, he said he ran for provincial office in 1890 and 1898 elections, but was defeated first by J.M. Kelly and then by J. Fred Hume. And in terms of the 1890 election, author Ted Affleck said, "The erudite Farwell was widely esteemed, but his unfortunate habit of pillorying people with his caustic wit did not endear him to the common man." And he said he lost out to the genial James M. Kelly. There were only, I think, less than a couple of hundred people who were eligible to vote, and that sort of included sort of Revelstoke and sort of Nelson, that whole area. And there weren't a lot of people who could vote at that time, but so it was. But Farwell, I think, and also because of the way that he had handled his land, the land dispute here, he was seen as sort of being responsible for really keeping Farwell or keeping Revelstoke from moving forward when it should have in terms of development. So he wasn't really well liked here. He died in Nelson on July 29th, 1908 at the age of 67. And his instructions included that he was to be buried in the Ross Bay Cemetery in Victoria without a service, and his marker is still there. The Farwell dispute continued for many years. In 1901 and 1902, G.M. Sproat, acting for A.S. Farwell, wrote a series of letters to City Council regarding lands owned by Farwell, and we have those correspondence in the archives. And one referred to the cemetery, which actually was included in the Farwell lands. Sproat claimed that Block 39, which had several burials in it, was still owned by Farwell and had not been included in the federal transfer of properties. And so Sproat wrote this absolutely brilliant line to the city, said, "I hereby notify you on behalf of Mr. Farwell that he will not permit you to trespass on Villa Lot number 39 for access to the cemetery or otherwise, as said lot is required for other purposes. Any inconvenience which this notification may cause will be, I am sorry to have to say, the direct result of your inattention to the circumstances. So I think we should all memorize that line and use it because it's brilliant. Anyway, eventually things I think were settled amicably and the cemetery lands were transferred to the city because Block 39 is an active part of our current cemetery. So we'll just look a little bit more in terms of what was happening in Farwell. The name was actually changed in June of 1886, and then it encompassed the whole area. So it encompassed the Farwell town site, and that was really at the behest of the Canadian Pacific Railway Company. They petitioned the Dominion Post Office Department to change the name. And they were basically saying that said the name of Farwell is attached to it, but W.C. Van Horn was basically said that Farwell was a squatter with no rights in the area. So completely disregarding the fact that Farwell had a provincial deed to this land and just called him a squatter. And so the post office department said that, yes, they would change the name, seeing that the name Farwell amounted to nothing at all. And the railway company requested that they name the community Revelstoke after their benefactor who had basically saved the company from bankruptcy. So that's why we became Revelstoke. And actually the lower part of town was referred to as Revelstoke. This part of town where the railway station was called Revelstoke Station. And that continued for quite some time. There was two post offices. So there was post office on Front Street in one of the store buildings, and then a Revelstoke Station post office in the Bourne Brothers store up by the station. And there were other separations too. There was, two tennis clubs. There were two fire departments. There were, two toboggan runs. So there was quite a bit of rivalry between the two areas as well for quite some time. So we'll look at a few more pictures of Front Street. So again, this is showing the Columbia House Hotel. And you can see the sign is right there. And it was kind of actually like a double building there, two sort of hip roof buildings side by side. And on this side of the street, I'm not sure exactly where in relation to this, but there was the provincial police station was on that side. This is Corsier's General Store. And you can see how the road curves down there. It's another photograph from about 1890. And J. Guy Barber, who is a jeweler, had a store just off where you can see the edge of the photograph here. And again, there's the Columbia House Hotel. So you kind of use that as a point of reference. So obviously, it looks barely graded, but there's a little bit of a rough wooden sidewalk in there, and but still pretty rough looking. No brick buildings there. Everything was wood construction. This is one of my favorite photographs in our collection. It was taken by Richard R.H. Truman, who is a well-known British Columbia photographer. And he was standing on the roof of one of the buildings on Front Street, looking down. There's our reference point of the Columbia House Hotel and the Victoria Hotel, which was built on the other side of the other corner there, H.N. Corsier's general store. So George LaForme was one of the early packers into the Big Bend, though he was a miner, but he made most of his income from packing supplies into the mines in the Bend. And of course, just to clarify, Big Bend is the land north of Revelstoke in sort of the bend of the Columbia River. So the Columbia River flows north past Donald or past Golden and Donald, and then takes a big hairpin turn about 100 miles north of here and then comes back down. And that country was referred to as the Big Bend. And rich mining country going back to the 1860s when there was it was a gold rush in the area. So there was still, in the 1890s, there was lots of mining activity. There was kind of a rough tote road up there. So George Laforme had these major trains of pack animals that he would take supplies up into the area. Um, in his career as a packer, there were two occasions where he actually had to kill his animals because they were caught up in the Big Bend, and major snowstorms came through, and he wasn't able to get them out, wasn't able to get feed into them. So he actually had to shoot his animals twice in his career. But you can see here these well-packed animals and their handlers with them. This guy is wearing kind of, when you zoom into the original photograph, he's wearing kind of almost like a sombrero and kind of a Mexican style jacket. But really brilliant photograph. And there was actually an article in the newspaper describing when he took the photograph, so that's why we're able to date it. So this is, we have a series of what they called fire insurance maps. And this was a series from 1905, although there were additions made onto it. So some of the things on the map were put in after 1905. There were additions up to close to 1920. But this is where you can sort of see what was happening on the street. And so there's Wilson Street. That's where the Big Eddy Bridge goes across now. And Wright Street is where where the old wooden bridge went across. So there's at this point it says it says 1910 old and dilapidated. So the Columbia House was kind of out of service by 1910, but that's where the Columbia House was. And this is where the Victoria Hotel was. So it gives you an idea of where the location of those buildings. On this block here, between Benson and Hanson, there's several of these buildings that are noted as being Chinese. So there was a little bit of a Chinatown happening there, including what they refer to as a Joss House, which is a Chinese temple. This building here, kind of where Benson goes across, was the Oriental Hotel. And we'll be looking at that in a little bit. And then on this map, which shows from Hanson to Kootenay, you can see there's the Central Hotel, the big house that was owned by the Corsair family, this house that's still there, and we'll see a couple of pictures of that, and this building which became Needham's warehouse, and a few other things going on. There's the courthouse in that block.
What's that line going through the center?
That's the base of the hill. Yeah, so that's so this is the top of the hill here, and there's, as I say, the courthouse. And yeah, it was just sort of showing the line of trees at the base of the hill. So there were several big hotels on Front Street, and the reason that you wanted a hotel back then was not just so that you could sell rooms, was so you could sell liquor. If you had a hotel, you could get a liquor license. You could sell bottles of liquor. There were no liquor stores until 1922. So if you wanted to buy a bottle of liquor, you'd buy it at a hotel. So obviously they did have rooms, and they did have people staying there. But the Central Hotel was operated by the Abrahamson brothers. There was John, Andrew, Noah, and Charles, who came here in 1885. And they were originally settled in Minnesota from Sweden. A lot of Swedish settlers came to Minnesota. And quite a few of them, when the railway was under construction, crossed the border into Canada and followed railway construction west. And so the Abrahamson brothers were working on railway construction, but then they quickly got into the business of supplying provisions as the workers were moving across. So they would hunt for buffalo and other meat and provide meat, baking, provide sort of rough hotel accommodations, and they were doing that all the way across the line. And then they realized that Revelstoke was going to be a major center. So they decided to settle here. And some of them kind of walked through but from, like, would have been like at Beavermouth, and walked from there into Revelstoke with supplies and horses that were following sort of very rough tote roads through the pass, if you can imagine that, and made it here in 1885. One of the brothers took part of their provisions and went on a raft around the bend, which didn't really go very well. He ended up, the raft he was on sort of flipped over. They did lose quite a bit of the supplies. Luckily, he survived, and the dog and the cat that he had with him also survived. But they managed to make it here. They actually were able to bring a pool table in, because pool table was also a good moneymaker for a hotel. Their first winter, their hotel was basically a big canvas tent with wood along the sides of it. And then they rebuilt a couple of times. This was their hotel as it looked in about 1900. And then by 1908, it was this quite big 3-story with over 50 rooms. And so the hotels, they would have people passing through, getting hotel rooms. Also in the winter, they housed a lot of the miners from the Big Bend who were coming into town to winter over in town. So that's how they survived. The Central Hotel was in operation until Prohibition came in the province in 1917. So they were no longer able to sell alcohol except under some very, very strict conditions. And I think one of the Abrahamson brothers was actually charged with infractions of the Prohibition Act, and they ended up having to close because they just couldn't make enough revenue without the liquor sales. And it was eventually torn down. The Pratolini company, who were builders in town, who built the courthouse and quite a few other buildings, they ended up buying the hotel for salvage and salvaged a lot of the material in it. One of the other hotels was the Oriental, and that was the Stone family, who were also from Sweden. Stone doesn't sound like a Swedish name. It was originally Stromdahl, and they anglicized it to Stone. And again, they had been in Minnesota, crossed over, and were following the railway line, doing pretty much what the Abrahamson brothers had done. And when they were operating at Beavermouth, and Mr. Stone Sr. had already arranged for a hotel to be built in Farwell, and he got his son, John Albert Stone, to come to Farwell to oversee construction. Well, John Albert was a little differing in ages that I've seen, but probably around 15. And the railway hadn't been completed yet, and there was just very rough sort of tote roads through Rogers Pass. So he walked from Beavermouth to Farwell in April of 1885 by himself. And so it said it took him 4 days to get here, which is actually pretty good. But he was terrified quite a bit of the time, both of kind of very rough laborers that he was meeting along the way and wild animals, because he didn't know what to expect. But he made it here. His father eventually came. They built the hotel, and they originally called it the Stockholm House Hotel, and then later changed it to the Oriental. And that again was rebuilt a couple of times. This is how it looked in 1900. And then they expanded and into close to the size of the Central so this is how it looked by 1910. And again, it didn't survive the Prohibition, and it was gone by before 1920 as well. And then the Victoria Hotel was on the corner of Front and Wright Streets, and also built in 1885 by William Cowan. And you've heard me speak about William Cowan before. He was quite an entrepreneur. He had the first telephone line in town between his hotel and the railway station by 1890. And then in 1896, he started the Revelstoke, Big Bend, and Trout Lake Telephone Company, and built at a telephone office in town and owned the telephone company for quite some time. He also founded the Revelstoke Water, Light, and Power Company, which built the first water line to Revelstoke and the first power plant on the Illisillet River. And they eventually sold that to the city of Revelstoke in 1902. And he also was one of the original partners in the Enterprise Brewery. So had a lot of fingers in a lot of pies. But he said he liked the telephone business the best. So after a while, he sold the hotel and just concentrated mostly on the telephone business. The Lawton family eventually bought the hotel. Just sort of a little side note here. I don't have the picture here, but when the Lawtons bought the hotel in about 1914, they had a house built next to the hotel, really pretty little house. And then when the hotel went out of business, they bought property at the corner of 4th Street and Mackenzie Avenue, and they moved the house from Front Street up to Mackenzie, and it's at the corner of 4th. It's one that Eileen Fletcher owns now. Some of you who go way back maybe remember it as Mrs. Burroughs' house. But yeah, that was actually moved from Lower Town to that area. There's the fire department in the early 1890s. As I say, this was the first fire brigade. And later, a second one was formed for this part of town, because even at the time that they were forming this and were planning on having their station on Front Street, the people who were in this part of town were complaining about that and saying that they didn't feel they would get adequate coverage. So in 1898, they formed the 2nd Brigade, and the two brigades were separate until 1922 when they finally united. It's an interesting photograph, sort of from the courthouse hill, looking down into to Farwell. It's probably about 1890. This house is still there. Well, we used to say that it was the oldest house in town. We don't say that anymore, because I do not use the words oldest first, biggest, best, because somebody will always come along and dispute that. And because they moved buildings all the time in Revelstoke, we can't really tell whether there could be older houses that were moved to another location. What I will say is that it's one of the oldest houses existing at its original location. I'll go that far, but I won't say that it's the oldest house. But the interesting thing in this picture is that and what people know as Needham's Warehouse would have been around here, and it's not in this picture. So we believe that Needham's Warehouse was built in the early 1890s. So this is a very early picture, looking down into the Farwell settlement. And there were several buildings on Douglas Street as well. But Front Street at this time still remained the downtown center. There's another one that shows that house, and you can see, sort of looking down Front Street here. And there is the building that is now, that was Needham's Warehouse. It was originally built as J.R. Hall Meat Market. And so it's probably the meat market in this photograph. And it's currently Alchemy Studio. And this one was quite faded, but looking down over Lower Town. Oh, there's one thing I wanted to mention about this photograph. It actually, you can see there's a little mark there. This actually was in a glass paperweight. So we were able to scan the paperweight and get not a bad rendition of version of the photograph from the paperweight. But that's the line you see is actually a break in the glass of the paperweight. And then this one was quite faded, but you can see there the J.R. Hall Meat Market, or later the Needham Warehouse, and there's the Central Hotel there.
There's no snow then.
Yeah, that's snow.
Roofs don't have snow on them,
Yeah,
Ground
there's
looks like it.
yeah, there's snow on the ground there. You can see a little bit of a spire here. That would have been the fire hall there. And it's an interesting photograph of Front Street, a couple of boys on their bikes. Another one from the base of the hill looking down to the town site. You can see the Central Hotel there and the Victoria Hotel at that end. And there's the J.R. Hall Meat Market, or the Needham Warehouse. And I think several of those houses were owned by Needhams as well. There's a bit of a colony of them down there. This was a hand-tinted photograph. And again, there's the Central Hotel and the J.R. Hall Meat Market and Victoria Hotel. Yeah, again, there's a fair bit of snow on the roofs there. So, photograph showing this is the 1910 wooden traffic bridge that was built. And again, there's the Victoria Hotel there. And you can't see it too well, but the Oriental Hotel is there, and then the Central Hotel. So we have quite a few photographs looking through both directions there. This is a favorite photograph of mine. It's the only photograph we have of the interior of a brothel. There were, as I say, there were several operating both on Front Street and Douglas Street. They kind of, a lot of them sort of got redirected over to Douglas Street when Front Street sort of became the main business street. But there were several houses operating. And we have the police record books starting from 1900 when the city had its own police force. And in 1900, I counted names of 50 different women who were brought in on prostitution charges. They called it various things. Infraction of bylaw 9, which is the bylaw around public morals. Sometimes it would say like keeping a house of ill repute, keeping a disorderly house. And the women were charged different amounts depending on whether they were referred to as a keeper, or which would be like the madam, the woman who owned and ran the house, or the inmate, the women who, the sex workers who were working in the homes. But this is a really interesting photograph. There's a nude on the wall, which you wouldn't have seen like in the mayor's wife wouldn't have had a nude on her wall, for example. Several musical instruments there. And in the early census, I think it's a 1901 census, some of the women whose names that we also found in the police book were listed as musicians. Some of them were listed as seamstresses or waitresses. A couple were listed as prostitutes, which of course we now use the term sex worker, but that's a term that was used in the census record. The other thing I found, and their dresses are gorgeous, really, really beautiful. The other thing I find interesting about this photograph is that it's really typical of that sort of overstuffed Victorian style of interior design and dueling patterns. Like you can pick out at least 6 different patterns going on here between the wall and the ceiling and the carpet and the couches and the curtains and the drapes over on that side. But as I say, we know a lot of their names, but we don't know what their stories were, or why they were here, or why they were working as sex workers. But I'm sure there were as many stories as there were women. There's even a couple of stories that the early 1920s, a lot of the houses were still operating. And there's one story where a woman wanted to move from one house to another, which was not something you really did. The women who ran the houses had strict control over the women who were working for them. And this one woman wanted to move, so they came up with this elaborate plot that she received a telegram saying that her mother was dying and she had to leave town. So they loaded her up, and instead of taking her to the station, they took her to the other house. And they had her lying low, but eventually it was discovered by the original woman who had control of her that she was at this other house. So the woman who she felt wronged by this worker being taken away from her, she actually came up with a plot to blow up the other brothel, and they actually set dynamite, and there was an explosion, a bit of a fire. Nobody was hurt, but the woman, the brothel owner, was charged and sent to prison, along with the two men that helped her. One of them, his nickname was Sticks, as in sticks of dynamite. And apparently he'd been able to get a hold of some sticks of dynamite from the construction of the Connaught Tunnel. So it's quite the story.
What would be the population of the town if there were 50 prostitutes?
Around 1,000. Yes, yeah, but there were a lot of single men, a lot of men working for the railway, and not too many families established here yet. In
I
fact,
saw some young people in some of the pictures, little guys.
yeah, there were families here, there were children here, but it was still, an emerging population, and yeah, and as I say, very male.
Madam actually owned the building.
In some cases, yes, yeah, according to the tax record, some of them did own their buildings. Some of them would have, they would be renting them from someone else, but yes, a lot of them did own their own buildings. The movements of the women were restricted. There were certain days of the week that they were allowed to do shopping, and they always had to be accompanied. So if they were coming up to this part of town, they had to be taken in a carriage and brought up with usually a man with them, and then do their shopping, and then go back to their homes. So this is a photograph taken, I believe the date we have on there is around 1907. And this is a funeral procession, because the access to the cemetery at that time was down Front Street, under the railway bridge, and then up the hill to the cemetery grounds. And this is probably like looks like lodge members. And then they were, and there's a lodge member at the front, possibly a Masonic lodge, and then the band members, and then the horse-drawn hearse would be back here. But you can see the town is, the Front Street is fairly built up by then. There's H.N. Coursier's General Store. You can see the Central Hotel. But as I say, there were never any brick buildings on Front Street. It was all wood construction. It wasn't until they started building business buildings up on Mackenzie Avenue and First Street that they started doing more substantial brick buildings. So by 1910, a lot of the shift was complete to this part of town. But there was a few businesses remaining on there until about 1920. There's not a lot that remains in terms of marking Farwell. This is a cairn that's at the courthouse, that was, I think, put up there in the 1950s. And it just, very brief. It says, at the second crossing of the Columbia River, the town site of Farwell, later to be named Revelstoke, was located on the 20th day of October, 1883. So that's when he filed his original request for land, by Arthur Stanhope Farwell, who came to British Columbia in 1864 and served as a civil engineer until his death at Nelson, BC in 1908. So that's about all there is left of really commemorating Farwell himself. This is a 1955 fire insurance plan. And if you compare that with that earlier 1905 one, these blocks were all filled in. Again, there's Wilson Street where the Big Eddy Bridge goes across now. Nothing showing there. And here's a planing mill, which was later purchased by the McGinnis family until it burned down. A couple of other buildings there. There's one remaining Chinese-owned building there. but not a heck of a lot happening there. So there was a period of really kind of emptiness in Farwell for quite some time. And a little bit more going on Douglas Street here. There's the Needham business. And where those townhouses are going in now, there was actually a little auto camp there. So with little cottages, so you could, if you're traveling through, you could rent a little cottage. So that happening there, but not a lot actually on Front Street there. So, there was that period of several years where not a lot happening on Front Street. And then it started to get more housing and apartments built on. So it's entirely residential now. There's no commercial buildings on it. This was the Corsair home, which was the Corsair family had the large home and big gardens there. And that's where the River's Edge Apartments is now. There's Farwell Park, which was opened in 1962 by the Doki Lodge. And some of you might remember the old wading pool. It was there. And what became some very dangerous playground equipment. When I was taking my daughter there, there was, you had to be a little bit careful on the equipment down there. And then the Farwell School, which is now Okanagan College and Stepping Stones Childcare, was built in the late 40s, early 50s. But the name Farwell isn't attached to that building anymore, but is still attached to Farwell Park. And this was the mill on that I showed you in that map burning down. And this is a photograph of the opening of the RCMP detachment, which is where the art gallery is now. That was in, I believe, 1967. So that was, brought a little bit of life to the Farwell district for a while. And so that's Farwell in a nutshell. As I say, it's been 140 years ago that community that town site was established. So our next Brown Bag History is on Wednesday, April 16th. We'll have guest speaker Rosemary Tracy speaking about Mount Begbie School. And she taught there for many years and has lots of photographs and stories to share with us. So thank you for coming today.